So with that said, guest speaker today is Calico. GitOps coming on the 8th. On the 22nd of October, I will be doing an AWS Professional Architect Cram session, and to take a break in the middle, I'll do a Terraform demo, which is something I love to work with. Acing the AWS Certified Security Exam will be next. You always want to make sure you get those security certifications when you do these cloud certs. We'll be talking about AWS Crypto Bot using Terraform, and then we'll be going on to Azure Solutions Architect. A lot of people ask me about this exam, showing you the prep for this. It's going to be very similar to the AZ 700. I recently just aced that exam, and pretty much the prep for this is going to be the very same thing. Let me warn you though, Azure, during the pandemic, Azure turned off labs, and so you can just go ahead and take a quiz and pass. But now labs are turned back on, and they can be challenging. I just did my 3rd Azure exam with labs, and so I'm getting better and better at it. So we'll let you know that, and I will cover on how to pass the lab section of the exam and what you need to do for that. Okay. With that said, our last one there will be acing the Azure AZ security exam. I just recertified. Recertification is really simple. I'll talk about recertification as well. With that said, my standard intro, I'll go through this very quickly. Lots of times what's happening is our whole ecosystem is changing as far as technology is going. And, I want to tell you that right now, when we talk about AI, these machines are not achieving consciousness, but they are housing human intelligence. So you need to respect that. But in many instances, they're becoming smarter than us, and we need to meet that challenge. You're going to see as far as programming is concerned, it's going to be like stitching of yesterday. You see all these guys standing here and going, there's no way a machine can do this. Guess what? Next day, they close the whole place down, and you end up, running the shop with 10 phone machines. And you're going to see very much of the same thing kind of happen with AI. And with that said, don't be afraid. It's just you have to be a continual learner. And one of the great things about on Jeff's resume, I was talking to him before the chat, before we started, is that he has on his resume, he's on the learning curve. And I told him, I've been in technology for over 30 years. I now have like 21 certifications. I've worked on all sides from front end to back end, and I still feel like a novice. So if you feel like, oh man, I don't know anything, it's just moving that fast. It's like the entire infrastructure is moving from underneath us. And so Jeff's going to help us work with that, because Calico is a great system, and he's going to talk about how that works and how you can get certified for free. Before we get to that, here's the icebreaker. What is the one thing that you're unbeatable at or want to be unbeatable at? What do you think? Think about that for a second, and we'll see if we get any answers to that. Anybody want to shoot for that one? Anybody want to try? Okay, excellent. All right, good. Well, we're going to go ahead and pass the screen over, and we're going to let Jeff introduce himself.
Excellent.
Jeff, you were on your way, buddy. Thank you so
okay,
much.
Well, thank you very much for having me. And I'm here. I'm to talk about Calico. I'm actually not a networking person, so this is a lot of fun for me. It's a learning curve. Now, before I start off, I want to tell you a funny little story. I'm from Toronto, Canada, and I went to the first Kubernetes East meetup since beginning of COVID. And they had this situation where if you answered a question, they give you some swag. And so everyone's, hands up, and I got a question and I answered, and he reached in and he pulled something out, threw it at me, and I went, no, because it was a mask. So after 2 years of COVID, I thought, t-shirt or something, and I got a mask.
God.
However, it's a nice mask. And I've got an 8-hour flight coming up next month to Europe. And Canadian Airlines and German Airlines still, you need a mask. And I thought, well, that was meant to be. Anyways, just to show that on every down moment, there can be an upswing. Just have to put it into context. Okay, so thank you very much for having me. And what I want to talk about today is Calico and Calico certifications, but I'm also going to do a small introduction to Calico. Calico, in case you don't know what it is. A friend of mine said, what is that, pudding or something? And, because, Tampico, whatever it's called. But no, it's to do with networking. Anyways, who am I? I'm a senior cloud solutions architect at Tsunati. I'm also a Veeam Vanguard, Veeam Legend, Big Cat, Calico ambassador, and an Auth0 ambassador. So I do a lot of talking, as you can tell. My background is 20 years working in IT. For the last 13 years, I've been in data protection. That's my main area of work. I have previous experience with some major service providers, backup service providers. I got interested in Kubernetes around 2019, and it was one of these typical IT situations. The company that I was working with, the software Veeam, had introduced a capacity tier for their repositories. which was S3. And I started to play around with this, and I need to test. And so I used this system called Minio. And they said, well, you've got to do this in containers. Oh, okay. And I thought, well, and they said Kubernetes. I thought, well, I'll go on the weekend, I'll do a bit of reading and then have it up on Monday. That was not what happened, obviously, because I had no idea of how big Kubernetes was. But it got me interested. And since that time, I've been able to complete all the CNCF Linux Foundation certifications. So the CKA, CKAD, CKS, and just recently, they introduced the KCNA, and they allowed me to be a beta tester for that. Now, if you Google KCNA, it comes up with a North Korean news agency. That's not the certification. It's the Kubernetes Cloud Native Associate. And it's an interesting certification, I'll point out, because people were claiming that the CKA was like giving somebody a parachute and 1 hour of training and having them jump from an airplane. It was not an intro certification at all. So this one is an introductory certification of Kubernetes. It's multiple choice, and it's one that we're recommending to people who are just starting. Anyways, despite having these certifications, as Michael said, I very much still feel like I'm on the learning curve for two reasons. One is, as you know, being an IT person, half of the deal is the theory, so certifications, but the other half is experience. And many of us are still getting hands-on experience. What's written in the documentation is not always what happens in real life. And so you become a full IT person by having both, So that's why I feel on the learning curve. And because of this, I'm always looking for new certifications, books, anything at all to kind of strengthen my knowledge. And of course, like everybody else, I have a budget. So if there's anything that's really good value, I'm up for that. Okay. So what is Calico? I'll briefly talk about what Calico is. So it's an open source project, Project Calico, with an active development and user community, okay? Calico open source was born out of this project and has grown to become the most widely adopted solution for Kubernetes networking and security. Project Calico is backed by Tigera, and it was founded by the original Calico engineering team. Okay, so it's a trusted, it's running production system, it's running production of many large enterprises and SaaS, financial service companies, and manufacturers. So it is really the big league of network security for Kubernetes. Okay, the largest public cloud providers have selected Calico to provide their network security. So Amazon, EKS, Azure, Google, IBM. So this means, for instance, if you visit any of these, you'll see the option to use Calico as part of their service offerings. Now, I like this diagram here. It's not my diagram. I'd like to claim it was given to me by Calico, but it shows basically all of Calico in a nutshell. So it's really good. And the cat, by the way, is the what do you call it? The mascot, right? So that's quite nice too. So basically, if you look, you've got the self-managed Kubernetes distributions, OpenShift, Rancher, Mirantis, containers, VMs, bare metal. Now, also I'll point out later, also on Windows. Okay, it works on Windows. And for the cloud, as I said before, EKS, AKS, GKA, and IKS. Okay, so people will ask, okay, Calico, well, what is it? And I say it's a CNI. And people say, well, what's a CNI? CNI stands for Container Network Interface. And the idea is that it's a plugin. Kubernetes, when it was built, was not really designed for security, and they didn't have things, they don't have identity managers or anything like that. Those are extras that have to be added on. And networking is one of them, including like storage too. You have container storage interface. And the idea is that people can write plugins, or organizations write plugins for these elements. So Calico is one of them. There are others, but Calico happens to be the most widely used. Okay, now some will say, well, what? Kubernetes doesn't have any networking? It does, but it's very basic. Okay, it's called Kubernetes. It's limited, and for AWS, for instance, since the AWS Meetup group, it's limited to 50 EC2 instances. So you can't really scale that. And there are other problems with the default Kubernetes networking as well. Okay, so again, you don't have a bloated Kubernetes API because these plugins are on the outside, and you can add them, and then third-party organizations like Tigera, Calico can improve and add features, and it's very, very useful in that sense. And you have to have one of these to really properly organize and manage your networking resources. Okay. So an example, what does Calico do, for instance, better than the basic Kubernetes? And I think probably, well, in my opinion, the most important would be network policies. So what there are in Kubernetes are the concept of namespaces. And namespaces you can think of as like little folders. And if I create an application, let's say Geoff's application, I'll want to put it in a Geoff namespace, okay? Same thing if I create a Jane or a Bob application, I'll put it in their namespaces. The problem is that by default, there's no network segregation between namespaces, okay? Now, why is that bad? Well, if you have super security application running in namespace 1, and then you have hacker application running in namespace 2, guess what? They'll be able to talk to each other, which is not a good idea. So what you can leverage in Kubernetes are called network policies. And one of the best practices by default is to set a default deny. So you deny everything by default, and then you slowly open things up, okay? So that's good. However, in Kubernetes, network policies can only work on separate namespaces. Now, if I'm at home, I've got 3 namespaces in my little test lab, no big deal. But if you've got a huge production of hundreds of namespaces, you don't want to hire a whole bunch of people just to create separate network policies. So Calico has network policies as well. Their network policies can be global, okay? So you can create a network policy and then have it go down on multiple namespaces at once. So right off the bat, that's a huge saving and helps you organize better, okay? So other things that are interesting with Calico are, for instance, you can actually use Calico network policies on nodes as well. You can't do that with the network policies in Kubernetes. So the actual nodes, which are components of Kubernetes, something like, I don't know, servers in the old times, you know, vSphere servers, whatever, that's a Kubernetes node. You can have them work on those as well, and Windows nodes. Now, people ask me about Windows and Kubernetes. You can leverage Windows, but they can only work as worker nodes. There are things in Kubernetes called control plane nodes, which are kind of like the brains, and then there are worker nodes that do the work. So Windows can be a worker node. And I'm not talking WSL, Windows Subsystem for Linux, just a real Windows node. Calico policies can also be leveraged on them, so it's very important. Another interesting factor too is encryption. You can encrypt, you can enable encryption between your nodes using Calico, which is very important, obviously, as well if you're wanting full security. And one of the other really interesting things that Calico can leverage is eBPF. Now, eBPF comes from originally BPF, which was the Berkeley packet filter originally. It's been around for a long time. In fact, if any of you have used TCP dump, which is a sniffing tool in Linux, before 2014, it used the Berkeley packet filter. And then they created the extended one. And what is this? Okay, it's like a little virtual machine, but running in the kernel, in the Linux kernel. It's sandboxed, and so it's totally secure. And what are the advantages? Performance, huge advantage, okay? So obviously, if you're inside the kernel, you're gonna be able to do a lot more, and you're not gonna use as many CPU operations, for instance, as, let's say, IP tables, which the default kube proxy, which Kubernetes uses by default, would use, okay? There's other things you can do too. It's not purely networking. You can sniff with eBPF like TCP dump, but there's all sorts of things you can do with it. And Calico leverages that. Again, these topics are very deep. I'm just hovering over the top, and then whichever one you're more interested in, you can then dive in later because there are the certifications which I'm going to talk about. Okay, so how do you get started? And this is an important question about Kubernetes in general, because I've recently, well, relatively recently got started in this, 3 years, and I've done quite a bit. And what I have found is there's a lot of information out there, but Kubernetes is a steep learning curve. It's not that it's complex. It reminds me of a big mosaic that you see on walls. If you look at it from afar, it's like, oh my goodness, how am I ever gonna, right? So the idea is you've got to go up close and go step by step by step. It's the only way to do it. And then it's not so complicated. The good thing is there are a lot of free resources out there, and Calico is one of the excellent examples of this. Right off the bat, what I'll point out is if you have no knowledge about Kubernetes networking at all, just the free ebook they have, which I'll pull into my screen here, is fantastic. It's a whole education in itself. Let me just bring this over in my Mac. This is a 51-page ebook free. You just have to give them your, work address, whatever email, covering basically all of Kubernetes. So networking, that is. So preparing for any of the Kubernetes certified exams, this is also a great piece of documentation. Again, network policies, Kubernetes networking, services, ingress, you name it. There's eBPF, and then Calico comes towards the end. Now, I will mention too, there is Calico Enterprise, which is not open source. That is for huge enterprises, obviously, but for learning whatnot, Calico open source is fantastic enough. So this is a fantastic ebook. I highly recommend it. After reading that, you'll know a lot more about networking than you ever did before when it comes to Kubernetes. And it's a difficult topic. It's one of the harder ones when you're dealing with the Kubernetes certification. So it's wonderful that Calico have done this. Now, there's excellent documentation. There are blogs. There are events that they have, free events, similar to this AWS meeting, but they meet up, but they will also have events where they'll go in deep and discuss various topics. And of course, the free certification. Now, I've got also here some of the websites, which I want to show you. For instance, on the documentation. There's AWS, just to prove that it is there. And you can just go to the AWS page and install it. However, you can also just go to the startup here, install Calico, and it's extremely quick start. There it is, intuitive. So I remember I didn't know much at all about Kubernetes, and I was just kind of getting my my hands dirty. And one of the reasons I chose Calico was the other ones was all these. It was complicated. Everything was complicated. And here there's the one YAML file that I did, and it was running. Now, I didn't understand what it was doing, don't get me wrong, but at least it was working. And that's one of the more satisfying things of Kubernetes is just getting something to work. That gives you the, kind of confidence to continue because it does seem complicated. And there's two ways you can run this, by the way, if you're just doing it for fun. There's an operator, which is normally for bigger clusters, or there's just one YAML file that you can apply in your Kubernetes cluster, and that will be enough. Okay, and by the way, getting back to Kubernetes, I'm jumping around a bit, but I want to mention this. If you don't know anything about Kubernetes at all, or the history, there's an excellent documentary, which is out there in Google, you can, or on YouTube, you can Google it, Kubernetes documentary, part 1 and part 2, which explains a lot about what I was talking about before, of how Kubernetes started, what they were aiming at doing. So if at YouTube, you can find that, it's just called Kubernetes, the documentary. All right, so I also want to go and talk about the certifications, obviously. Give me 1 second. PowerPoint back up. Oh, and by the way, one thing here you'll see, I've got the link here. If you want to get up and running and just play around with it right away, you can test this in Minikube. Now, Minikube is a small mini distribution of Kubernetes, which you can get up and running on your laptop, okay? And you can really mimic production. In fact, I know people who have passed all the Kubernetes certification exams, and they've never actually touched a real production. They've used Minikube on their laptop, okay? So this is one of the beautiful things about Kubernetes. For people who are around when virtualization came in, there was a lot of excitement because you couldn't have 20 physical servers in your house to practice for exams. So physical servers made things a challenge, but with virtualization, you could actually get quite a lot done. Well, you can amplify that twofold now with Kubernetes because you can basically do almost everything on your laptop. And there are these mini distributions out there which you can leverage. Minikube is one of them. There are other ones too, but Tigera on their documentation page have a step-by-step for you. So you can get up and running and look at it right there. Okay. So with the documentation in the PowerPoint, you'll see I put some links there to the quick start, which get you going. If you're a programmer or you like APIs, there's the APIs there. They've got it all written down there. And the GitHub, so the GitHub's there, you get that. And there's the blog as well. And the blog comes out periodically with people writing about certain topics, obviously. It's also a good educational resource. Okay. The events. So for instance, the last one I think was the Kubernetes Security and Observability Summit, which in 2021, totally free. And coming up this December is going to be Calico Con. So it's going to be like KubeCon, all the Kubernetes organizations now have their cons. There's KubeCon, Calico Con will be in December. There's going to be a lot of interesting stuff going on there. So the events. The certifications. Okay, so right off the bat, I would recommend reading that ebook that you've got in the documentation there that I've given you first, just because that is enough in itself. It's a whole education. However, after doing that, or if you don't have time for that, the certified Calico operator level 1 is a sensational certification. Okay, so it's completely free and is not one of these, walk in the woods certification. I know I had some people telling me the other day, well, Geoff, free certifications. It's one of those things where, A, B, C, and you pick it and then you fail 10 times and you get it. No, this is not the case. Okay, this was difficult. Obviously, it's not a proctored exam where you have I don't know if any of you have done proctored exams during COVID. I had to do a bunch of them, and you got the camera on you and you're not allowed to mouth the questions or anything. For Red Hat, you can't even use a wireless mouse. I'm not joking. You had a wired mouse. So someone's obviously figured out how to intercept mouse signals from the other room. So it's a really good course, and they're tough exams. And I'll just show you here this one start off with. So there it is, certified Calico operator level 1. Now, does that mean they're gonna have a level 2 in the future? I don't know. They might, but this in itself really gets you, from A to, I almost say Z, because it starts with Kubernetes networking, what we talked about, but goes into depth. Everything you need to know, services, so all that. And I would say that if you did this course for your certified Kubernetes exam, if you decide to take that, you're pretty much ready from the networking perspective. That's how good this is. And with the exams, you can take them as many times as you want, but you have to tell them if you fail, they'll reset it. So you can't just, one day take it 1,000 times, and they can be quite challenging. Okay, so that's the one that I'd recommend right off the bat to take if you're a newbie and starting, because it covers everything, including Calico, of course. But as I said, it's not just Calico. It starts with the basics. Okay, so by the time you get to Calico, you can't start with Calico because you need to know Kubernetes networking before that. Otherwise, it's going to be completely, incomprehensible. All right, so what about the other ones? Well, and I've done that one. This one I'm halfway through. This is a wonderful one too. It's eBPF, and it goes into the technology of eBPF. Now, the second part, there's a little bit of coding. You don't have to code yourself, but you can copy and paste and stuff. But that's why I keep procrastinating, because I want to learn it and whatnot. But it's a little deeper. And by the way, these all have labs in them, so you can use. It's not just pure memorization and whatnot. There are labs, so you can actually play with this. And I found that everything you do in these labs, you can also do on your own Kubernetes. So for instance, you can take in your Minikube, install Calico, and then start playing around these things as well. So it's great in that sense. Here, for instance, it's going to tell you how to deploy this, for instance, in different distributions like OpenShift. And also it's going to talk about eBPF and WireGuard. So WireGuard's what Calico leverages to do its encryption. You don't have to have it on if you don't want to. If you do, it's a very simple, it's just a one command, and it'll turn on encryption between your nodes. Okay, so it's optimum security. And that is our, or their eBPF certification. Now, AWS folks are going to want to do this one. I haven't done this one yet. It's on my to-do list. Again, though, it's going to go deep into more AWS concepts. And you'll probably recognize all of these little things here that it's got. And I highly recommend it as well, even though I haven't done it, but I've heard people who have done it. Now, I have done the Azure not too long ago, and I found this really challenging because I don't work in Azure, okay? But again, similar to people who have never worked with Kubernetes networking and do the first Calico Tiger, the operator course, I found after this course that I knew a lot more about Azure. They introduce it in such a way that you learn it at the same time. Obviously, I'm not an Azure expert. I'd probably completely fail their exams, but nevertheless, it was really worth from that perspective. I had the feeling I was killing two birds with one stone, to be honest. And this exam was tough. In fact, I failed this one twice before I actually passed it. I'll put it down to my not knowing Azure, but I just want people to know that it is challenging. So, it's worth it in the sense that you don't feel like, okay, I did it. And no, this is good. And
Geoff, I just wanted to interject. These exams are challenging. So
yeah,
I have passed two of them, but they were very challenging.
Yeah, exactly. But and it's good because the thing is that they're open book too. This thing, I mean, well, you can't go back in the course. I think Block's even doing that, but you could Google whatever. But that's not going to help you. And from someone who's done all the Linux Foundation Kubernetes exams, especially the command line ones, that's open book. You got the Kubernetes documentation, but that's not the problem because, especially in the Kubernetes exams, they're going to hit you two ways. One is you have to know where in the documentation to look, because otherwise you lose time. And they're putting big time pressure on you. So you can't learn it on the fly. That's impossible. But even if you know it, if you don't know where to look quickly to copy a YAML, so you don't have to type the whole thing out, you're going to lose that way. And then there's the muscle memory. You have to practice, but you have to be able to type things fast. You have to learn all the shortcuts. So this is different in that sense because these are multiple choice, but they're challenging. They're going to make you think. And it can be frustrating because when I failed it twice, I'm like, goodness, this is so embarrassing. No one knew, of course, except for the people had to ask to reset it. But at the same time, I learned it better, right? I mean, there's no point taking these things just for the piece of paper. Okay. And finally, there's AWS, there's the Azure. So there's 4 right now. I don't know if there are any plans in the future to introduce any more, but I think there are. But at the same time, remember, it's not just an exam, it's a whole course. And I think by default, they're like 4 weeks, supposed to be 4 weeks. I mean, you could do them in one day if you wanted to, but at the same time, probably better to space them out and do a bit each day. That's my general rule for studying for exams. I do a bit each day rather than to cram all at once. I find it kind of sits in the head longer. So yeah, that's what I would recommend. Now, again, even if you do the courses, the best thing after that is to actually get a system up and running. And again, you can leverage a Minikube, you can leverage a micro KAD. You don't necessarily have to set up an instance in AWS and start paying for it. All this technology you can just use in the other location as well. So are there any questions? I kind of sped through quickly. I'm used to being pressured for time because a lot of the Kubernetes things are like, you've got 15 minutes. And so I got people sit there, hey, what do you say? This is recorded. Does anyone have any questions?
Yeah. So is there any details about how long the duration of exam and type of exam? Some other additional information can you give? Like this operator level one?
Yeah, from what I remember, I don't think there was, what was it? An hour and a half or something, or I don't remember so I don't remember time being a problem for the Tigera exams. Remember, they're not proctored, so there's no one watching you or anything like that. I think there was a time clock, but it doesn't say, but I don't remember that being a problem. Perhaps, do you remember, Michael, if you've done one recently? Because the last one I did was about 3 or 4 months ago.
Right, I did not. Time was not an issue.
Yeah, so
I felt
probably
like I
wasn't
had
an issue. That was the
thing. Yeah, and I think I could leave it and come back to it as well. So yeah.
So I mean, again, and there were some questions there, for instance, that you could tell that someone, when they built the exam, they had tried Googling just to make certain that it wouldn't be just, oh, I Google and there's the answer. Oh, I Google, there's the answer. That didn't work. Not that I tried that, of course, but if you're tempted to, which is good because you want to learn it. So time was definitely not a problem. There might have been a clock there. As far as more details about the exam, I think, so for instance, there are practice tests or exercises, I think they call them, or whatever, in the actual course. Okay. So one thing I do remember, if you did well on the practice tests at the end of each section, so the courses are divided into sections, and they will have at the end of each section I think it's a knowledge check or something like that. And they were quite tough. Now, not some of those questions were similar to the ones that were in the exam, some of them, but not all of them. I think there was a few which were, put it this way, similar in a way to put you in the wrong. So if you were just trying to do this, brainless and, copy and, they would get you into trouble because there, it's the old trick of having a long thing and then not somewhere in there. So you're reading, oh, I know this, and you press the answer, but you didn't read the not is not this, things like that. But I found that if you did the, so for instance, I don't think there was anything in the exam that wasn't in the combination of the course and the practice test, put it that way. So if you really do the course well, My issue was I do these things after work in the evening, and so I tend to be tired. So I have to go over numerous times, a lot of times, to get it right, especially if it's Azure, when I've never really worked in Azure. But when I say challenge, I don't want to scare people off. It wasn't impossible. Don't get me wrong. I am not a networking person. My big background is data protection. So restoring VMs, restoring now Kubernetes. So, but of course, I have to know some networking. It's like, you know, people who are networking, people have to know some, you have to know a bit of everything when you're in today's modern IT. So for me, maybe it was more challenging than if someone had a CCNA, for instance. So not impossible. I think if you go through the course and you're doing well to practice exams, you won't have a problem with them. Any other questions?
I'll make a comment on the level 1. You can do level 1 on your laptop, and I did. I went through the entire lab exercise on the Mac. When I got to Azure, and Geoff, I have not passed the Azure exam yet either. I did pass the AWS, but not the Azure. I learned a tremendous amount. I went, wow. When I went, it's really the research was more. But one question I have, when I get to Azure, what's the best way to save money? Because I'm in the shell and I'm bringing up the Kubernetes, and then it's charging me. So what do you think the best approach would be to saving money on prepping for that exam?
So what I did, because I did do the Azure in the end, I mean, I failed the exam twice and then I finally got it. What I did, because that was a concern, I would limit the time I was actually doing the command lines on Azure. So I did them. But again, a lot of this is theory. Obviously, you want to practice, especially for the real Kubernetes. Well, as in the Linux certifications, Linux Foundation certifications, you have to practice, right? You have to practice. For the Azure one here, you need to practice a bit, but you could also memorize. And so I was watching it. So I was watching it. It was going to get into because you've got a certain amount of free you can use, whatever. And I ended up, I think I did pay a little bit, but not very much. So it depends. Now, if I've been a person who's every day working with Azure, and this was going to be a very big part of my daily job, then I would obviously have gone the full Monty and, you know, done every single exercise on Azure and whatnot. But with my situation, this was more of an interest on the side. And so I did some, but I limited it. And then the rest, I just memorized theory. So I think you can do that too. I don't know about the AWS one, if you're able to do that as well or not.
Yeah, I think that what you're really saying, and I get this, is do enough hands-on so you can understand the concepts.
Yeah.
And if you're reading and you understand it, you're fine. But if you need to do the hands-on to understand what you're doing, that's when you really need to hit it and maybe use it, cut a little bit of expense. When you're done with that, you know, go ahead and delete your resource group. That will delete everything that you've created.
Make sure you do that, because otherwise, and of course, the good thing is the Tigera, I'm sorry, I keep saying Tigera, that's the big company, but the operator level 1 and the EBF don't need anything like that. So you can do those on mini clusters.
That's excellent. Wow, thanks for
AWS and Azure, of course, you really should. Again, if you're using AWS for work or you're using Azure for work, you could always bring up a little instance. And it's not that it's super heavy. It's not, I mean, if you watch it and you're careful, I think you can get away with minimal, if not nothing as far as payments. But again, I'd rather be safe than sorry. I've heard the horror stories of people, you know, on a Friday, oh, I want to make the party. And they leave the thing running and they come back on Monday and they're bankrupt, right?
Right.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know if those are true or not, because but you never know. So I was just careful in that sense. So what I'm saying is it's not impossible to pass these without having done all the command lines. I mean, again, they have the practice tests and whatnot. So I did avoid some of the things that were going to get dangerous financially.
Thanks for the advice. Appreciate it.
No problems. Are there any questions apart from the Tigera, but in general about the Kubernetes exams and whatnot? Because again, this is what I'll emphasize again. This is excellent training for if you're going to go for Kubernetes later on for the networking component. This is perfect. If you do these, especially the level 1 operator, I would say you're ready for the CKAD networking part of the exam. That's how good it is.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Jeff. I appreciate
No
it so much.
problem.
I'll put
Appreciate it.
this recording up and I'll send you the link, okay?
Thank you very much.
Thanks, guys. Thanks you, Laura, for bringing Jeff here. He did such a great job. We appreciate it so much. All right,
Thank you
bye,
very much.
guys.
Thank you. Thank you
Thank
for
you.
having
Weekend, guys.
us.
Have a
Have
good
a great
weekend.
weekend.
Bye.
Excellent.